Hello, everybody. It's Jason, and welcome back to the Thermostat podcast. 2021 is here. We are all excited about it. We are certainly, we know that the last year has been challenging in so many different ways: global pandemic, social unrest, political uncertainty, economic uncertainty, challenges around social justice, and where our kids are being schooled, home or online, all of the ways in which we've been challenged in the last year. And I wish I could report to you that all of those challenges are over, but of course they are not. But what we try to do on this podcast every single time is to provide a time and space for you to step back, for you to think about where you are, hopefully engage your mind and heart in conversation that's going to fuel you, help you wherever you are on your journey. And then to think about what are the things of all the things that's swirling in the world and that might be out of our control. What are the things that are within our control? And certainly all of us as individual leaders and humans, what's within our control. But then how do we help fuel and set the temperature for the cultures of the teams and organizations that we are lucky to serve, and certainly all around. So wherever you are listening or however you're coming to the podcast today, thanks for joining in and being a part of this. As always, thank you for everybody out there who rates the podcast and shares the podcast and comments and 5 stars and all of those things that help amplify these messages out into the world. That's whether you like it or not, that's how these things are shared. So thanks for everybody for doing that. I am super excited to invite in my guest for today to this chat in just a second. I always love it. I'm really grateful and lucky when good people and people in my life and my networking around say, hey, there's people that you just need to know and you ought to just know each other. So a quick shout out and thanks to Kurt Landon, from the CEO of Inspira HR. Kurt said to me we had been connected by other people who said we just ought to know each other. And as we were talking, he referenced my two guests today. And I know Tamara and I have connected previous to this, and he just basically said, you guys just need to know each other. So super excited to connect. And I think in this conversation, you'll see why he was connecting us, and that the spirit and the research that they've done aligns with all the stuff that I'm doing and the work that we do to benefit and develop leaders and culture. So excited to have them on the podcast today. So once I learned more about Tamara, Myles, and her research partner, Wes Adams, and their research to uncover the principles of meaningful work and thriving cultures, I was excited, to say the least, to connect further. Tamara Myles is a productivity and meaningful work expert. Both of the guests hold masters in applied positive psychology from the University of Pennsylvania. And Tamara is the author of the book, The Secret to Peak Productivity. Wes has been an organizational transformation consultant for 20 years and passionate about social impact. He helped produce an HBO documentary that sounds really cool. And together, their research around the 10 principles of meaningful work has been shared all around the world. So Tamara and Wes, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. So great to be here. And yes, thank you to Kurt for introducing us.
I love it. I always love it when, great people connect you and literally without any agenda whatsoever, but they just say, hey, you guys just need to know each other and the type of work. And to me, more importantly, the spirit of the type of work that you're doing is aligned. And so you ought to know each other. So excited to be bringing you into the podcast today. So let me start out. I'll start with Wes first, and then Tamara, I want your thoughts on this too. But before we dive into some of the research and data that came out of this study you did on the 10 principles of meaningful work, I like to start out with why is this even important to you, and why did you even want to go on this journey to look into this kind of research and data? I'm a big mission and purpose and why for everything that I do, certainly. So why was this interesting, and why even go on the journey to find these things?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. It's great to be here. I think for me, the idea of meaningful work sort of came from, I spent about 10 years working a lot with mission-driven organizations, social enterprise, larger nonprofits. who are trying to solve some of the world's biggest problems and make positive change in the world. And one of the things I saw during that time was, these are groups of people who were really focused on accomplishing something big. The mission, the purpose is what brought them together. And you would think that they would be amazing places to work, right? Because everybody cares about the same thing. And that does help, but it's also not enough to make it a meaningful workplace. Some places, even like big nonprofits, you can see Amnesty International a couple of years ago, there was a big write-up. They had, a bunch of the board members resigned and the culture was really toxic there,
Yep.
According to an independent report. And so I was really interested in figuring out, what are all of the different things that leaders need to do to foster a meaningful work environment. Because when you're really engaged, when you find your work meaningful, you're at your best. You're working at your full potential. And so that's kind of what got me into this line of research.
Love it. Tamara, how about you?
Yeah, for me, I came with a productivity lens. I've been working with leaders and individuals for the past 15 years on productivity. And I developed a productivity model, which, it's a 5-leveled approach, similar to, it's based off of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And at the very top of that pyramid, where self-actualization would be, is a level that I call possibility. Because what I discovered in working with these leaders is that once they create some systems and put some practices in place, they have this extra time. And so productivity for the sake of being productive is not enough. Is productivity towards what? For the service of what? And so what productivity does when you have good systems in place is it enables you to spend more time on meaningful work. And so I really wanted to understand what that is and what enables that, because also from a personal standpoint, I've experienced work both as just a job that I, paid the bills, but also as really meaningful, where I really cared. And it wasn't necessarily nonprofit or social justice work. It was just the culture that enabled that. And I wanted to understand why.
Yeah. And so any of my listeners out there, even just from those quick descriptions of why you even entered the research, or they're right now, they're saying, oh, okay, now I get why they're on Jason's podcast, because obviously everything that I do, I just believe this at our core, that we all as humans want to be a part of meaningful work, in the world, and work beyond career work, but we want to be a part of something in our lives that is meaningful. And in fact, whether we know it or not, whether we can articulate it or not, that we want to be a part of something that's greater than us. So the understanding and the teams and organizations certainly that are then proactive about saying, how can we create these cultures where meaning comes to life, and that we help to infuse that and bring that out of people, are the places, in my opinion, are the ones that succeed and thrive and all that. So of course, I'm excited to have you guys here today. So for the listeners out there, tell us a little bit about, who are the companies and organizations that were involved, some of the names that were part of the research, just to give that. And also, how did you define meaningful work? Because I think the definition, at least the short definition of that for listeners, is probably helpful. Do you want to split that up? Maybe Wes, you want to give us kind of who are the companies involved, and then Tamara, you want to say kind of how are we defining meaningful work?
Sure. I'm actually going to do it the opposite way, because I think it's important to understand what we were looking for first, and then why we went to those companies.
Love it.
So, meaningful work, we define as work that is personally significant, that allows for growth, and is connected to something greater than the self. And that can be your team, that can be your community, that could be making the world a better place. There are all levels of that. And I think what's important to understand is meaning is experienced at the personal, individual level, but leaders have a real outsized impact on how that happens in the workplace. So we were particularly interested in learning how leaders can facilitate and foster meaningful work, because we felt that they have the most ability to impact organizations. And for us personally, it meant that we could help as many people as possible reach their full potential. So I'll let Tamara talk about how we, found those organizations and how the research progressed from there.
Yeah, so we decided to do this method of research called exemplar methodology. So we really identified the criteria for organizations to be a part of our research. And we chose organizations that were doing this well already, because the whole idea behind exemplar methodology is that by studying who's doing it really well, there's a lot that you can learn and then apply to people who want to get there. And so and we try to really identify organizations across a range of industries and also different sizes, because we wanted to know, like, are these principles universal? Are they specific to industry? And so we interviewed 12 organizations, and we had a couple, a few tech like Microsoft and Google. We interviewed hospitality organizations like Marriott. So, Microsoft and Google, hundreds of thousands of employees globally. Marriott was our largest organization with 750,000 employees globally. But we also interviewed some smaller organizations like 15Five that has 150 employees, Chick-fil-A, KPMG. So we tried to do a wide kind of diverse range of organizations.
Yeah, size and across different industries and different types of organizations to get that kind of cross-functional, feeling of are all the same things happening across these organizations. Is that accurate?
Absolutely.
So, Tamara, I remember on our very first call where we connected and we were talking, and I was all eager to learn more and hear more about what you'd found and all that. And I remember you even kind of giggling and saying that, when you guys first went out on this exploration, that you were excited to uncover these things that had never been found before, and this, like, what was the secret sauce and this thing, and then to the great point that you made, is that what really it began to do is affirm things that maybe we already certainly know. And I know from anybody who's been a part of this podcast or read my book Thermostat Cultures, then the stuff that we've been talking about and that is right in front of us, but that maybe there wasn't this thing that we found, like, that magically was the thing we had never heard about. But there were things that surprised you, or at least that affirmed in you when you saw the data and the findings. Is that accurate? Am I portraying that accurately?
Absolutely. We joke about this all the time, because the metaphor that you said, like explorers, is exactly what we really were like. We're going to be explorers of meaningful work. And we thought we would discover new things that no one ever, thought of or discovered before.
Right.
And what we started out as like a little bit of disappointment that the things that were emerging from the data were so like common sense, ended up being a huge benefit of the research, because Stephen Covey said common sense is not always common practice, and it's easier in a way to teach leaders these things that are common sense, because you don't have to spend a lot of time convincing them of them. It's just how to implement these practices. So a metaphor we like to use is like swimming, learning how to swim. You can't learn how to swim just by knowing about it, by reading about it, or watching videos about it. You have to actually get in the water and swim and practice. And it's the same with these 10 principles. These are 10 leadership behaviors that you have to like get out there in the world and practice them and do it and learn from it, get feedback. So it's actually exciting that that they are common sense, because we have found that leaders are really interested. They know they need to make work meaningful, but they don't know how. When we are the first, our research is the first research that empirically ties leadership behaviors to meaningful work.
Yeah, and sometimes we just
to be fair,
step back.
Go ahead. Sorry,
well, we just need to step back and be able to then make sense of it and say, hold on a second. Okay, this may seem obvious, but just because it's obvious doesn't mean that we implement it. And just because it may seem simple doesn't mean it's easy. And so that kind of validation and affirmation, I think, is really significant, that came from your study and research. Wes, how about you? What surprised you or affirmed you, or kind of what jumped out to you did you have the same experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think Tamara was definitely sure we were gonna blow open the world of organizational psychology, and find some groundbreaking stuff. And it was, when we talked to more and more leaders, and like the principles started coming together, we were like, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. And I think we both kind of had that feeling. I think like Tamara was saying, leaders everybody's talking about this right now. More meaning at work, the way that we need to reimagine work and bring things like well-being and resilience and all of those things that are currently adjacent to the work that we're actually doing, bringing those into the fabric of work itself. And so I think, it's not a lot of new information, but understanding how to do it is something that folks don't necessarily know. And, we're researchers, but we're also practitioners. We've spent many years working, consulting, coaching, training folks, working with leaders. And, we didn't want this to be an academic study. We wanted to really understand, how do we take what's happening and really apply that and provide a playbook for leaders to be able to make work meaningful for their teams. So I think, that was a really important, an important point for us. And I would say also, like for me, I started to think about, one of the things that popped out to me was how important it is to start thinking about this before you even hire people. One of the behaviors that we list in the research is that you have to think about your values when you're hiring people. It starts before the onboarding process, and getting the right people in the door is such a critical part of creating a community of people that collaborate with each other, that care about the same thing, that are going to work well together, challenge each other, grow together. And that, I think, we're very skills based, like, what have you done? What skills are you bringing to the organization? And, really character needs to be a much more important part of, values alignment, or we like to say values add, instead of just alignment. That to me was a little bit eye-opening, that it really needed to happen a lot earlier on.
Yeah, no doubt. That's, again, my listeners, that'll ring true, and that will resonate with them. Tamara, of those 10 principles, was there one that, or a couple of them, that jumped out to you as again, maybe not as this is a revolutionary idea, but just became more and more affirmed by like how foundational and important it is? I certainly have my thoughts on all of these principles, but what jumped out to you?
So there's a couple that really are very common sense, but are so important. And one is the fostering of the relationships across the organization. And they're interconnected. So the other one is this idea of really embracing and engaging the whole person. So authenticity, encouraging authenticity at work, and then really embracing those people who show up authentically when they do. And, we have been reading so much of the research of this loneliness crisis that is happening now at work, at home. People are lonely. We have lost the communities that used to connect us, like, church or bowling or the other things that we used to do. And so we really want from work now much more than just a job. Like, people want belonging, they want purpose, they want meaning from work. And so the organizations that are providing this and that are doing it really well are creating a sense of community in the organization, not just within teams, but they really foster organizations across the relationships across the organization. And one example is the Zappos. They talked a lot to us about how they do that from the moment they onboard people. They onboard teams that, from C-level executives to just entry-level positions. They onboard them together. They do this boot camp, and they encourage them to foster the relationship and continue the relationship even after the onboarding is done. Google does that as well. While they're onboarding, they schedule meetings monthly to stay connected to people that might be in different countries and in totally different units. So that was really important. And then with the authenticity, is just creating these environments where people don't have to wear an armor to come to work, right? Where they can show up as parents, as people dealing with mental health issues or addiction, and they can talk about it. And it really starts at the leader level modeling that behavior and creating like psychological safety so people can really be vulnerable and show up authentically. And from our research, a beautiful example of that, a company that does that really well is HubSpot. They, when COVID hit in March and everybody started working from home and schooling from home and quarantining, they recognized that parents would be really affected, parents with young children. So they hired musicians to do concerts for the kids via Zoom so that the parents could get a break and they could put and it would be interactive and enriching. They also took care of their AA community of employees who didn't have AA meetings to go to. So they hired AA facilitators to host Zoom meetings so they could continue to, to stay with the program. So those are just examples of like how these companies really don't just talk about it, they actually do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And to see the recognizing and what I hear you saying is the intentionality around how do you bring these things to life, and the intentionality of honoring the whole person and supporting the whole person. And obviously all of these are interconnected. And as when you shared the research with me the first time and I looked at it and said, oh, okay, they're all of course, again, very affirming and very exciting for what I've already talked about in my book, but also for the work that I do with teams and organizations. It was like, yes, this is absolutely, this is what it is right in front of us, and they're all connected. But what at least jumped out to me is a number of things. One is this idea of a collective ownership of the culture. The teams and organizations that I support, this idea that and I talk about us living in a participatory world more than ever, that we need, and the best teams and organizations are the ones where everybody becomes an ambassador for that culture, which means we need to have an understanding. We need to be able to articulate, well, what is that culture that we're trying to create? And we have to have an understanding of what is that, what does that look like in action and behavior? And if language helps drive behavior, then how do we describe that future culture that we want to create? And how do we begin to have values that are going to guide us that way? And so all of us are participating in that. And then once we have clarity around that, and that we are intentional about, collectively, we all have ownership in the creation of that culture, then it becomes even more clear in my language as we begin to anchor it in everything we do. And so, Wes, to your point a minute ago, is like, then it's like, okay, now once we have that vision, now it's easier to be able to connect it to who are we looking for and how do we hire people? And then once we hire the right people, that how do we begin to onboard them, not just as here's a task and a job you're going to do, but onboarding them culturally, that now you are an ambassador for this culture that we're trying to create. And how do we then honor your development as an individual and a whole person along the way? And that, all of these things begin to layer on top of each other. And so we collectively become more aware of the temperature that we're trying to set individually, but then also collectively, of not just what we do, but how we do it. And so I love to see in the research that interconnectedness, but at least that's what jumps out to me, is that kind of the collective ownership piece of that. Does that resonate with you at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you really nailed it. These are separate. We list them as separate behaviors in the research, but so much of it is intertwined, and it would be hard to pull anything out. And certainly, if you were just doing one of these things and not the others, it wouldn't be enough. But yeah, I think the point, you really nailed it with the collective ownership and the need to be participatory. And especially as we continue to face, basically perpetual change and disruption and uncertainty in our world. You mentioned all of those things in your introduction, all of the craziness that we've been dealing with and will continue to deal with. We need the creativity and the input of everybody from a lot of different viewpoints to navigate those things. And, that's where innovation comes from. That's where the ability to be resilient and adaptable come from. And I think it's a strong argument for diversity. We're having this big conversation now also about diversity in the workplace. And there's one way to look at that idea of having shared values of, oh, I'm only going to bring people like me into the organization. And what's really interesting is that all of the folks that we talk to they don't see it that way at all. The leaders that we spoke to said, we get nothing out of hiring clones. That does not benefit us. It's actually really important that we're bringing in people who care about the same things, but are going to challenge us on those things.
That's right.
If you really care about collaboration, why are you doing it this way? Why aren't you doing it this way? Why are you, you've said that, we're an eco-friendly company, we care about the environment, but we're buying all of our supplies from somebody who doesn't make sustainable things. So, you have to create the space for people to speak up and to have those difficult conversations. And not our research, but there's quite a bit of research out there that shows that when you do that and you have people with diverse viewpoints, the business is more innovative, more successful, all the way around.
No doubt. And what my personal experience with teams and organizations is when we get clearer on those values, and if the values themselves, if what we value is clear, that we value inclusivity, or we value a diversity of ideas and thought and experience, that if that is in our values, then it's easier for us to then look at something like collaboration and say, no, that's not an extra thing. That's a part of what we do and how we show up. And so, Plato said, what is honored will be cultivated. So if we truly honor these things in not just words, but in action and in the way that we show up with each other, then all of a sudden that's what ends up being cultivated. So these 10 principles of meaningful work, again, they may sound simple, but not easy. But let me ask you the question. So somebody that looks at the research or looks at those 10 principles and then says, okay, well, yeah, this is common sense, like you said, Tamara. So why doesn't this? I mean, I've got plenty of thoughts on this myself, but why aren't these practiced? If they're common sense and they're simple, where's the breakdown? Why aren't these embraced by teams or organizations?
So a couple of different reasons in our experience, and Wes, feel free to jump in. So one of the reasons is what Wes talked about earlier, about these being adjacent to work itself. So when they were talking about well-being or productivity or motivation, they're not integrated into the fabric of work. And so it's hard, when leaders, everyone's busy, work is crazy. And so when you're focused on these outcomes and measures like engagement, productivity, and you're putting out fires, you're constantly in a reactive mode, it's hard to look at the big picture and the integration of it and weave it into the fabric of the work itself. And so that's one of the reasons. And I think the other one in our experience with the leaders that we're working with now is that they just don't know how, because right now, they know how to measure engagement. Most companies have pulses and engagement surveys or whatever. So it's easier to do that than to really integrate all of that into like, okay, how do we do this? And is there a way that you can teach me that is actionable, that are things that I can do at my team level? If I can't convince the whole organization, what is under my control? And so I think those are like the two main reasons that this isn't happening. And the metaphor that we use with leaders is, I don't know if you've read the book Upstream by Dan Heath, but he talks about how, there are two friends having a picnic and next to a river, and all of a sudden they notice that there's a drowning kid and they both jump in and save the kid, and more kids keep coming and they're saving and they can't keep up. And one of the friends gets out of the water and moves upstream, and the other one's like, where are you going? And he's like, well, I'm going to go upstream to see who keeps throwing these kids in the water. And so that's kind of how we're thinking about it. Meaningful work and making work meaningful is going upstream. And it's not just the downstream, saving the kids out of the water is engagement, productivity, motivation, focusing narrowly on just one of these measures at a time. And when you go upstream and make work meaningful, the research is very clear that meaningful work, when individuals experience work as meaningful, it leads to increased satisfaction, increased engagement, which leads to higher productivity, higher well-being. So it's all very interconnected. It's just a different approach.
So let me jump in because again, this is called the Thermostat podcast. So I've got to be able to then put it in that language that is commonplace to listeners on this. Is what you're describing is when we don't take the time to step back and have clarity of not just what we do, but how we do it as leaders and has entire organizations and systems, then it's way too easy for us to get stuck in thermometer thinking, which is purely reactionary and purely because we don't know what we're aiming for. And so the temperature just goes up and down depending on how I'm feeling today or what the external conditions are or who's in the room. And we get really focused only on a thermometer, which is like the pulse surveys or the engagement of just taking the temperature. Right. And we get in this very busy mentality of task, and then let me take the temperature. Right. But where we don't get good or the best organizations, the one that create these cultures that you're describing of meaningful work, one of the things that I believe and I see within the teams and organizations I serve is that I see that shift of mentality from thermometer thinking to thermostat thinking means we have to be clear on what is the temperature that we want to set as individual leaders. What does it look like in action and behavior? And have that broader view, like the upstream view of being able to say, no. How are we committed to doing this work? And so after we may take an engagement survey that tells us the temperature, then the question, the important and the more difficult part of the work becomes, all right, now what are we going to do about it? And how are we going to begin together to proactively set a different temperature? And that thinking and culture being shaped by the way we think, act, and interact is what that shifting of that mindset and that action becomes. Wes, what from your standpoint, like why doesn't all this happen? Is anything that I just said or that Tamara said, does it resonate with you? Why don't we all just?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I love the language that you just used. I think we would call that taking a meaning mindset, like really going upstream and approaching things intentionally with meaning at the core. And I agree with everything that both of you just said. I think, we're a very, especially in the US, a very outcomes KPI driven work culture. And especially when you're trying to, make quarterly numbers and that's how you're incentivized, that's how you're bonused, that's really where you're going to focus. And the reality is, focusing on meaning first results in all of these things that we're after, but it's hard to take that step back because generally we're not encouraged to, like you're not encouraged to take that step back and do that. You're just focused on like, are you making your numbers this quarter? Or, like, how are you accomplishing whatever the tasks are that your company has set out for you? And I think it's, that ability to take a step back and be more intentional is really at the core of all of this. So I love the way that you articulated that.
Yeah, and I want to just jump in also and add, like, yeah, I love your metaphor with the thermometer and the thermostat. One of the nuances of this is that, it doesn't have to be either or. You don't have to just save the kids that are drowning or take a meaning mindset. You don't have to either take the temperature or set the thermostat.
That's
like
right.
You should do both. You want to spend less time reacting because by going upstream, there will be less kids to save, but you still should care about these things. And they're easy because they're measurable, right? They're measurable outcomes. You kind of know how to do it already. And so, yes, keep doing that, but you're going to have to do a lot less reactive survival types, work if you also move a little bit upstream, move into the thermostat mindset and do some of this like bigger thinking or work.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you saying that, Tamara, because it does all belong. But I think for us to remember that and take that kind of mindset and heart to it, I think is really important. And where at least I've seen, again, firsthand with experience, is one of the reasons why I think we don't is just because, I mean, when Wes, you just described this kind of thing, is that again, we get so focused and so busy and we've been so focused for so long on the other outcomes those more tangible, quarter earnings and quarter results and all those things, those kinds of outcomes that we haven't practiced enough or learned how to do that taking of a step back and taking the deep breath and being willing to then, because we think we're losing time when we do it. And yet what we're, I talk about my formal company is Step Back Leadership Consulting. And the reason the tagline is step back to move forward is because every time we step back, we actually are moving ourselves forward when we look at that bigger picture upstream. And all of it, Tamara, like just what you said, all of it belongs. So we got to be able to take the temperature and understand how are we doing and where are we doing. But will we take the time and take the breath and take the step back to then say, okay, now what's our response and what are we now proactively going to do so that people don't keep falling in the river. Like that's a great way to think about it. So I know that those of us that are looking at each other on the screen right now believe this to be true. But one of the things that I think also is involved in this is the shifting of the mindset. And Wes, you just began to talk about this is beginning to redefine what outcomes may look like, and how do we define and make sure that our view is broader in terms of what outcomes we're seeking, rather than that just this narrow one financial kind of model part of it. And I believe, and I'm guessing you do too, that as we broaden that vision for what outcomes, the whole person, the whole meaning, the whole mission of what an organization is about, that as we broaden that, the other traditional metrics and outcomes will also follow. So when we talk about the future of work, which is really exciting for people to talk about now, what's the future of work and all these catchphrases that are out there, how does that fit into it in your estimation, that kind of broadening of what we mean by outcomes? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that kind of ties back to what we were talking about earlier. You talked about it as a broadening. I think we were talking about it earlier as an integration, but same thing. It's just really what are we actually trying to accomplish here? And is it yes, we're going to hit our KPIs and make this amount of money or sell this number of products or deliver these services, but why? Like why does the business exist? What is it trying to accomplish in the world? And how do we want to treat the people that are in our organization? And I think starting there is really important rather than starting at the end and trying to work our way back. And I think you used a word just now, practice, which I think is really important. I mean, we talk about these things, in the paper, they're called principles, but they're really leadership behaviors, they're practices, and they're things that, I think the good news about it is they're learnable skills, right? You have to practice them. You have to get better at them, but anyone can learn how to do these things. But you're not just expected to jump in and say, oh, okay, like here's the information. It's like the swimming analogy Tamara used earlier. Like you can't just read a paper or listen to this podcast and say, oh, yep, I got it now. Like, here we go. I know how to make work meaningful. You have to actually implement these things, and you learn and you see how it fits within your organization, because it's going to be different than the way that it is, at another organization. We have all these great stories from, Google and Microsoft and HubSpot and KPMG, but the way that they do it, you can't just copy paste. You have to understand what works within your own organization. And so it's an iterative process. Things are always growing, changing, adapting, especially in this environment. And so, it's just like continuing to work at it.
Tamara, your thoughts on that?
Well, two things. I want to talk about your stepping back to move forward. I love that. It's like the cha-cha. I was like, oh, I was thinking the cha-cha dance the whole time. But anyways, that's beyond the point. I love that you talked about the future of work, because we have been thinking a lot about that. And in talking to the leaders that we work with, I think that is one of the silver linings of COVID. It has allowed us to really pause and to do things that we didn't think were doable, right? So nobody thought we could all trust everybody to work from home and that work would still get done. Nobody thought that, we could let people make choices and have autonomy. And like, here we are, we're all doing that. And also, like, we are in each other's homes. We hear the kids, we see the dogs. And so work has become more human in a way. And I think that's one of the biggest trends right now, is this idea of making work more human. And meaning is such a huge part of that, of what makes us human, the striving for purpose, for creating the stories that narrate our experience, right, to make sense of it. And the three pillars, so these 10 behaviors really kind of fall under three big pillars of meaningful work. And that is belonging, purpose, and excellence. So these are, like, if you imagine a Venn diagram, at the intersection of the three of them is where meaningful work and this meaning mindset really lives. And so these are the same qualities, the belonging, excellence, purpose. That's what makes us most human. And so it's a beautiful intersection that when we recognize the things that make us most human, honor them, intentionally create environments that that foster this, it also produces the outcomes that we care so much about. So I think that's where the future of work is going.
No doubt. And I believe that, just to your point, that, and I've talked about this on this podcast as well, that the language I've been using to it is the pandemic has caused us to experience forced innovation, where it's forced us to then have to step back and figure out how to work remotely, or how to communicate with people differently, or how to be at home, and all of the things, and then also in many ways find new solutions to new things. And so I agree with you that I believe it's kind of forced us to step back, and now I think is revealing a lot of this stuff to us in ways that I believe is really exciting about the future of work, and how we're going to continue to realize that what it means to the future of leadership is more about creating these kind of environments and cultures for people to come alive at work and be a part of something bigger than them, and be a participant, a co-creator in the culture that we're trying to create. And the best teams and organizations on the planet are going to continue to be those that have that collective ownership over a culture, and realize that it is dynamic. It's always changing moment by moment every day. So we have to, culture isn't a thing we do every once in a while. Culture is something that we live and breathe every single day. And so we have to continue to be co-creating it. I could do this literally all day long with you guys and have this conversation. So I very much appreciate it. Wes and Tamara, thank you so much for being a part of this podcast. We're at our time now, but thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and all this. The research, by the way, is going to be in the show notes of the pod. And so people can track down some articles and stuff about it, so they can know more about it, because I really just thank you for the affirmation of the research that it's given. Not that I'm somebody that hasn't necessarily needed that, because I think we know this intuitively, but the research and the data, it is very affirming then when you say, oh yeah, it does back up all these things that we all know to be true, but doesn't mean they're easy. Thank you.
Absolutely. So great to be here. Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much. This is such a pleasure. I could also do it all day. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for joining in. For everybody out there that listening, again, thanks for being a part of it. I hope this has been another few minutes of your day, of your week, to step back yourself, to engage your mind and heart, to think about recalibrating that thermostat for yourself and for the people, whatever culture you're a part of, whether that's your family, your community, or certainly the team and organization you serve. Thank you for taking time to be here. Again, I'm more convinced of this than ever, that stimulating progress personally and certainly collectively within our teams and organizations, requires all of us to step back, to take that deep breath, and then intentionally think about what is the temperature that we want to set. And how are we going to intentionally design and create the cultures that we want together? And together, when we take those steps, we end up creating and setting a temperature that is authentic and compelling to us and to everybody around us. So thanks for everybody for listening. I hope you'll continue to stay tuned at Jason V. Barger on social media. and continue to, because there's a lot of great conversations and stuff still to come. Thank you and have a great day.